For a long time, the world has misunderstood strength. People think it's loud, aggressive, controlling. But true power, real, transformational power, is quiet. It's calm, and it's rooted in awareness. Awareness is the empath's turning point. For much of their journey, empaths operate from a place of deep feeling and intuitive connection. They often sense the emotions of others before words are spoken. This sensitivity is a gift, but in the hands of the wrong people, especially narcissists, it becomes a weapon used against them. Narcissists thrive on control, manipulation, and admiration. They recognize the empath's willingness to understand, to forgive, to fix, and for a time, this dynamic serves the narcissist well. The empath gives, the narcissist takes. The cycle continues. But something begins to shift. When the empath starts to question their own exhaustion, when they begin to wonder why they constantly feel drained, why love seems to hurt more than it heals, that's when awareness begins to bloom. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts quietly, almost subtly, a moment of realization, a pattern noticed, a contradiction exposed. And once that awareness begins, it's impossible to silence. The empath starts seeing the manipulation for what it is. Not love, but control. This is the most critical point in their transformation. Because awareness is not just noticing what's wrong. It's recognizing that they've been participating in a dynamic that doesn't serve their soul. It's realizing that being kind does not mean being silent. That being loving does not mean being used. Awareness is the moment they stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Why have I tolerated this?" It's in this mental shift that everything begins to change. The empath sees the narcissist not as someone to be healed, but as someone who refuses to heal. They start identifying the patterns, how the love bombing led to control, how the devaluation phase made them doubt themselves, how the discard cycle was always around the corner. They begin to connect the dots and understand that none of this was accidental. It was calculated, and they were the target because of their open heart. Now, with awareness alive, the empath starts to withdraw their energy, not in revenge, but in protection. They no longer feed the cycle. They no longer explain themselves to someone committed to misunderstanding them. This shift isn't loud, it's quiet, it's internal, but it's irreversible. Boundaries are not walls, they're power. For an empath, the concept of boundaries often feels unnatural at first. They're used to saying yes when they want to say no, accommodating others even when it costs them, and believing that love means self-sacrifice. This mindset leaves them wide open to the influence of narcissists who instinctively detect and exploit those who lack firm emotional borders. But as the empath awakens and begins to reclaim their energy, the concept of boundaries takes on a new and vital meaning. Boundaries are not about shutting people out. They are about letting the right people in. They define where the empath ends and another person begins. In the absence of boundaries, the empath is like a sponge, absorbing pain, confusion, and toxicity. But when boundaries are put in place, they begin to filter what they allow into their emotional and mental space. It's not rejection of others. It's a declaration of self-worth. For the narcissist, boundaries are a threat. They signal the end of control. They interrupt the game. When the empath says, "This is not acceptable," it disrupts the pattern. The narcissist's tactics, guilt-tripping, gaslighting, love bombing, begin to fail when they meet a firm, consistent boundary. At first, the narcissists might double down, escalating their behavior to regain control. But the empath, once grounded in their new power, begins to see this desperation for what it is, an attempt to survive without supply. Establishing boundaries isn't always easy. It requires unlearning years of people-pleasing and guilt-based decisions. It demands the courage to face conflict and the strength to sit with discomfort. But each time the empath holds a boundary, they reinforce their identity. They affirm their needs, their values, their voice. And something transformative happens. They begin to feel safe in their own presence. Boundaries are more than words. They are followed by consistent action. Saying, "I won't tolerate disrespect," means walking away when it happens, not explaining it over and over. Saying, "I need space to heal," means not answering every message, not showing up. These actions are not cruelty, they are clarity. They are the framework for a life built on mutual respect, not emotional imbalance. For the empath, creating boundaries is not just a protective measure, it's an awakening. It is a return to themselves. It is a message to the world. I am not here to be drained, manipulated, or minimized. I am here to grow, to give from overflow, not depletion. Boundaries transform the empath's energy from something that expands. They stop enabling and start choosing. They no longer carry what was never theirs. Healing is not weakness, it's clarity. For an empath, healing often begins in the quiet aftermath, the space that follows chaos. Where confusion used to reign and silence now sits heavily, this is where the real work starts. It's not loud, not dramatic, not made for display. It's internal, it's deeply personal, and above all, it's powerful. In a world that often celebrates toughness and endurance, healing is mistaken for fragility. But true healing requires confronting the very things that broke you without flinching or turning away. That takes strength. Narcissists view healing as a threat, not because they understand it, but because it signals independence. When the empath begins to heal, they start seeing the situation with new eyes. They no longer feel compelled to fix the broken dynamics around them. They no longer absorb blame for things they didn't cause. They begin to understand the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. This clarity allows them to separate their identity from their pain. As healing deepens, the empath learns that love without boundaries is not love. It's dependency. They see how their desire to care was manipulated into a reason to tolerate mistreatment. They realize that not everyone deserves access to their softness, and that forgiveness does not require reconciliation. Clarity allows the empath to stop romanticizing potential and start responding to reality. The fog lifts, and with it, the illusions that once kept them in emotional bondage. Healing means making peace with what you didn't receive. It means recognizing that the apology may never come, that the narcissist may never admit the damage done. But that recognition doesn't create bitterness, it creates freedom. When an empath stops waiting for validation from the very person who harmed them, they take their power back. They stop needing to be understood by someone who was never capable of understanding them in the first place. This process is not linear. Some days bring peace, others bring grief. Old wounds resurface, memories sting, but through it all, there's movement. Forward, always forward. The empath starts to build a life rooted in self-respect, not survival. They no longer define themselves by the pain they endured, but by the strength it took to rise. Healing teaches them discernment, who to trust, where to invest, and when to walk away. Healing doesn't make the empath colder, it makes them wiser. They don't stop caring, they start caring consciously. They become less reactive, more grounded. They stop trying to rescue those who are committed to their own dysfunction. This clarity extends into all areas of their life. Relationships become cleaner, conversations become more honest, choices become more aligned. The empath steps into a version of themselves that is no longer driven by fear or guilt, but guided by truth. Detachment is the empath's final breakthrough. It is the moment when emotional entanglement with the narcissist unravels, thread by thread, until there is nothing left binding the empath to the cycle of manipulation. Detachment doesn't mean the empath stops caring altogether. It means they stop allowing that care to be used against them. It is a shift in perspective, where emotional survival no longer depends on the narcissist's moods, opinions, or approval. It's the deep internal knowing that peace is more valuable than connection when that connection is rooted in chaos. For an empath, detachment doesn't come quickly. It is preceded by grief, confusion, and countless attempts to understand. The empath wants closure, explanation, and sometimes even justice. But the narcissist rarely offers any of these, instead providing only more confusion, wrapped in charm or cruelty. The empath reaches for reason, but none is found. This emotional dissonance wears on the soul until the empath reaches a moment of inner silence, a place where they finally realize that staying connected is only causing harm. Detachment begins when the empath stops explaining themselves, when they no longer defend their boundaries, when they no longer react to provocation. The narcissist thrives on reaction. Positive or negative, it fuels their need for control. But when the empath no longer responds, no longer engages in the performance, the narcissist loses their power. It's not about winning or losing anymore. It's about stepping away from the game entirely. This detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. The empath begins to see the patterns not as isolated incidents, but as a repeated strategy. The charm followed by control, the praise followed by punishment, the affection followed by abandonment. The empath no longer waits for the cycle to change. They acknowledge that the cycle is the pattern. They understand that the narcissist isn't going to wake up one day and become who they pretended to be in the beginning. With detachment comes a deeper self-trust. The empath no longer doubts their perception. They stop second-guessing their instincts. They recognize the manipulation, the gaslighting, and the emotional baiting as tactics, not reflections of their own worth. They no longer internalize blame. Instead, they begin to reclaim their own narrative. The emotional distance they create allows them to see themselves more clearly. And what they see is someone strong, aware, and deserving of real connection. Detachment also means no longer needing closure from the narcissist. The empath gives themselves closure through acceptance and self-direction. They stop romanticizing the potential of the relationship and start acknowledging the reality of it. They no longer wait for the narcissist to change or see the damage they've done. Detachment removes the emotional hooks and severs the invisible ties that once kept the empath anchored in dysfunction. In this space of detachment, the empath is finally able to redirect their energy inward. They begin to nurture themselves the way they once tried to nurture someone else. They begin to create, to rest, to rebuild. They stop living in reaction and start living with intention. The emotional turbulence that once felt like love is now recognized as instability. Self-love ends the narcissist's control. It is the moment when the empath stops looking outward for validation and starts anchoring inward for truth. Narcissists operate through the illusion that their opinion defines your value. They thrive in the vacuum left by someone who doubts their worth. But when self-love enters, that illusion crumbles. The narcissist can no longer manipulate with guilt, fear, or charm because the empath no longer seeks approval from the one causing the harm. Instead, they begin choosing themselves again and again, regardless of who misunderstands or disapproves. For the empath, self-love does not come as a grand declaration. It begins subtly, often after immense pain. It may begin as rest, as saying no, as choosing silence over defense. It may begin as a realization that not everyone deserves access to your heart. The empath who begins to love themselves becomes less reactive, more discerning. They no longer chase closure or cling to the hope that someone else will fix the damage. They stop waiting for someone to treat them right and begin treating themselves with the respect they've always given others. This internal shift confuses the narcissist. They may attempt to regain control through the same familiar strategies: flattery, gaslighting, passive aggression. But those tactics fall flat against the foundation of self-respect. The empath no longer rises to the bait. They do not engage in arguments designed to exhaust them. They do not respond to emotional manipulation wrapped in false affection. They simply walk away, not from hate, but from clarity. Self-love creates boundaries without guilt. It stops over-explaining. It ends the need to be liked by those who use love as leverage. The empath, once consumed with fixing others, now focuses on healing themselves. They nurture their own needs. They listen to their inner voice. They forgive themselves for not knowing sooner, for staying too long, for bending too far. Self-love makes room for compassion without enabling, for kindness without self-betrayal. The narcissist cannot survive in an environment where they are not the center of control. Once the empath sees their worth clearly, they become immune to the manipulation that once controlled them. The praise no longer sways them. The threats no longer shake them. The cycle no longer continues. The power dynamic collapses because one party is no longer playing the game. Self-love also brings forward the realization that you are not responsible for healing those who refuse to acknowledge their wounds. It lifts the burden of trying to rescue someone who made a choice to hurt rather than heal. The empath stops personalizing the narcissist's behavior and starts protecting their peace. They understand that love should not cost their dignity, their voice, or their well-being. With self-love comes the recognition that walking away is not failure, it is freedom. Choosing peace over chaos is not selfish, it is survival. The empath begins to build a life rooted in joy, not fear, in truth, not illusion. They make decisions from strength, not scarcity. They give from fullness, not desperation. The need to be chosen by others fades because they have already chosen themselves. An awakened empath is a force, not a victim. When an empath has moved through the stages of awareness, healing, boundaries, and self-love, something powerful begins to unfold. They no longer see themselves as someone who is broken by another, but as someone who is refined by experience. The same sensitivity that once left them vulnerable now becomes their strength, sharpened by wisdom and protected by clarity. They are no longer easily manipulated because they no longer confuse empathy with obligation. They no longer carry guilt for someone else's discomfort. They have learned to differentiate between being kind and being used. The awakened empath doesn't suppress their feelings, they honor them. They feel deeply, but now with direction and purpose. They trust their intuition not as a vague feeling, but as an accurate internal compass. They are no longer distracted by appearances or words. They observe patterns, energy, and intent. This discernment becomes their shield, allowing them to stay open without being exposed. The same heart that once attracted narcissists now repels them, because it no longer echoes the wounds narcissists seek to exploit. An empath who is awakened does not seek revenge or validation. They move on, not to prove a point, but to protect their peace. They speak the truth without fear. They no longer shrink to keep the peace or dim their light to avoid being targeted. They embody strength without hardness, clarity without cruelty. This balance makes them unshakable. They no longer react impulsively to manipulation. Instead, they observe, choose, and act with intention. Their presence changes the room. They uplift others not by sacrificing themselves, but by standing in authenticity. They understand their worth is not determined by who accepts them, but by how deeply they accept themselves. They no longer give endlessly to prove they are enough. Their giving comes from abundance, not a need to be needed. They know how to walk away, not as a failure, but as a decision made in alignment with their truth. The empath who has awakened becomes an example. Others watch how they move, how they speak, how they honor themselves. They teach not with words alone, but through energy, boundaries, and presence. They no longer engage in emotional games. They don't argue with those committed to misunderstanding them. They don't explain their value to those who can't see it. They simply live it. Their peace becomes louder than the chaos they once endured. What once made them feel powerless now fuels their purpose. They use their story to empower, not to relive. They turn their pain into wisdom, their silence into expression, their survival into strength. They walk with grace, but no longer carry what isn't theirs. They are no longer tethered to the emotional turbulence of others. They are rooted in self. They are guided by soul. They are free because they chose to rise above what was meant to keep them small.